My name is Rachel Flynn. I'm the Deputy City Manager for the City of Greeley. And I just want to thank you all for coming. It's just so important to get engaged in the vision and the future of our city. This area that we're studying is 22 square miles, and it's a big deal. It can either just happen, or we can together think about what our community will be going forward. I also wanted to let folks know, in case they weren't certain, that we will not be talking about Cascadia Entertainment District. That's not part of this initiative. That has its own timeline, its own public meetings, its own community outreach. So if you had come because you wanted to see that, we have information online, and we have recordings from past meetings, and we'll have future meetings. So I did want to let people know that this is a separate effort. So I'll be starting tonight with a brief presentation on what we call placemaking, and that is what makes places special: the buildings, the natural landscape, the open spaces, the streets, and all that. And I'll be talking about Greeley and its role in placemaking historically, and how we've, in many ways, kind of come full circle. Then I'll turn it over to our fine consultants who are here in the front row, Jeff Speck with Speck Dempsey, and Jason King with Able City. And I'll give a bit of an intro later. So as I said earlier, growth is going to happen out in Western Greeley. It's already happening. Do we want it to just occur, or do we want to get ahead of this and be intentional about what we want our future to be? And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. We've been hearing from our citizens that they want a sense of place, they want those amenities in a community, they want more walkability, and that is why we launched this effort. So let me get started here. So placemaking in Greeley. We're going to start this portion of the show with a quiz. So as Churchill said, we shape our buildings, and thereafter they shape us. And he said this after World War II, when they had to rebuild parts of London from the Blitz. And he said it was just so important, these buildings they had, and how they influenced people in their lives. And I would extend buildings to whole cities. And founders of our city gave us a great gift with the historic core of our city, its buildings, its infrastructure, its open spaces, and I want to talk to you about that tonight and why that's so special and why we're building on that. So here's the quiz. All right, where is this place? Okay, good. So far, so good. Where is this place? Excellent. Whether we like it or not, okay. It's a walkable place. Excellent. This was kind of a trick slide. Another trick one? Yes, the streets of Paris. Yes. And the most famous airport in the country, I think. And this will tell you why design matters. This is placemaking. It's probably the most recognizable airport in America, besides perhaps Dulles, but most of them are just these dull, utilitarian structures. And I just so admire the architects who came up with this, saw the majestic mountains in the background and said, we're going to honor that. And they created a very advanced tensile structure that is still holding up today. But it gives us great pride as Coloradans. And we want to, well, we'll never get a Denver airport here, but we could get other buildings that are just as notariable. So we have Greeley's identity in terms of place. This is not Bavaria. This is the UNC campus, exactly. It's beautiful. They have beautiful buildings there. This is the area we're studying, Western Greeley, and we're not here to just pave it over. We want to preserve those special views, and Jason and Jeff will be talking about that tonight. Frame those views, celebrate them, and they serve as catalysts for future development. the Poudre River Trail that I thank our council for really pushing forward and putting the funding into it and celebrating our special river. The Funplex, it is a fun building, don't you think? Where we are today, Ames College, that they really threw down the gauntlet when they built this, right? And when you pass by, you know you're at Ames College. It can be, a conversation starter, like, well, if you're going to meet me, go to that big welcome center on the corner of 47th, 20th, and everybody now knows this. This beacon of light, I think it's just so beautiful, the regional library link. And so let's go back in time a bit. So this was the first map, if you will, aerial of Greeley, and they really thought through the planning of this. It's a traditional American grid, and at this time, remember, the only way to get around in 1870 was that you walked or you took a horse. Now, people walk 3 miles an hour. Horses walk, guess what, 4 miles an hour. And so the scale of the grid had to reflect that, so time and space, and then the architecture had to reflect it because it had to be dense. And you have the ground floor retail, you have people living upstairs, whatnot, and you see it all here. And in the distance, of course, they have the Great Mountains. So this is Lincoln Park. It's just so dignified, a really beautiful place. Rather than cars, you brought your horse. This is 8th Street. And what's interesting, I guess they were having a parade, so I don't think they often got this many bicycles, but we did start getting bicycles in the late 1800s, but still, slow speed, very humanized streets. Then we had elephants. This was, the circus came to town. I don't think people rode around on elephants regularly. And then when you came to town, so say you're traveling from Denver, you go through Greeley on your way to Cheyenne. Look how beautiful it looked. They even had an archway to welcome you, to let you know you were in a special place. There's the Camden Hotel, or that is the name, right? Yeah. Campfield, thank you. And then across the street, that building survived. That was the Campfield office building, and then the theater in the foreground. I think that was called the Chief? And here on 8th Street, again, it's just beautiful architecture, beautiful public spaces, really honoring the history of this area. And then the neighborhoods that weren't very far, you would walk from your house to your office or to the theater, to Lincoln Park, what have you. And this was that grid. So in the middle, you see Lincoln Park, and everything was structured around that. The river, you could see it winding its way through the cache. And then the number 3 ditch was the southern route, the southern border. And if you look at all of Greeley today, this is that same area. So look how small it was and how they started. And one of the main reasons they picked the spot was because of the railroad, that if you were going to Cheyenne to get the Transcontinental Railroad, you came through Greeley. And what a beautiful structure that was. We now have another one that's, I think, equally as beautiful, but that was the first image people had. And then you might stay at this great hotel, at the Campfield. It started out as the Oasis, this office building with an opera house next to it. Just beautiful structures. Think of the time they put into this and the thought and the pride of place. This was our city hall, and we're looking at building a new one. Maybe we can emulate this. To the left was the library. This was one of the first high schools. Still there, beautiful structure. Churches have actually fared pretty well here. Most of them have survived. Strong history, obviously, with ag factories. This was the sugar beet factory, and unfortunately got demolished, but what a story it told, and you could see that tower from miles and miles away. These grain elevators, which I just think are striking and really tell the story of Greeley and northern Colorado in general, so much so that this entrepreneur started a distillery in one of them and was really celebrating it. And then you, again, have these neighborhoods right next door, beautiful pieces of architecture, so dignified, of all types and sizes, Italianate, Queen Anne, European Revival. Then the city grew. So from 1870 to 1920, 50 years, that green area, that was all the growth there was. So we went from 500 people to about 11,000 with these two portions. And one of the areas that got added was Glenmere, beautifully designed, built on the City Beautiful movement, nature focused, which is why they have the lake, and then all the houses around it. And it's matured really well, very desirable real estate, but it's about the placemaking. Nearby, we have more modest homes, these cottage style, arts and crafts style, bungalows. Look at the detail on these, and regardless of the time of year. This is a multifamily complex downtown, so just beautifully designed. And here, this could have been a grand home, but I think it was always multifamily. Then, at the next 50 years, it's up to 1970, you see that next blue area. I don't have that population figure, but I'll get that for you. Now what was happening was this little invention called the car came around. And the car had tremendous influence on how we design our cities and also architecture. It's really fascinating. I'll show you in a minute. But here you can see Hillside. That was our first shopping center. And then the houses immediately next to it. So this was the first time we shifted from mixed-use development, and again, Jason and Jeff will be talking about this, to isolated uses. And it was a thing called Euclidean zoning that they'll explain further. But we thought, mostly because of the Industrial Revolution, that we should separate where we live, where we work, where we shop, where we play. And these are the first hints of that. These were built in the 1950s. And it couldn't have been done without the car, because then you had to drive to each of these places. At the time, people thought, well, what's wrong with that? But then this thing called traffic started, and we didn't expect it. There wasn't even a word, really. And again, Jeff will get into that one. But this is how we used to do it. And by now, look at these cars. I'm not a car gal, but what year would you say those cars are? 50s? 57? Oh. Are you in this picture, Tom? That's his car. And still mixed use. There were people who living above or had their offices above. And again, when you were coming from Denver through Greeley, this was the place. This was the strip. Look at all those cafes. Holy cow. And you slowed down. This was the place to come. It was vibrant, but it was starting to shift. We were starting to lose that truly walkable, slow speed, kind of old world element. And look at the plan here. I think it's just really interesting. On the right is the traditional grid that was done 1870, 1920 through the 50s. And then look how the grid becomes curly. It's like it got a perm. And and that was because of the car, really. You know, the car could just flow differently. People often wanted to just, take the street around where that hill was. But when everybody had to walk, the grid was so essential. So, and then I thought this one was interesting. Deb, you'll like this. The mall, your favorite subject. There used to be a Jocelyn's downtown in this beautiful building. Sadly, we lost it, and they went to the mall because everyone loved the mall. It was new, it was shiny. It also had a sense of community because when you were inside, you hung out, you walked around, you saw your friends. I know I did that. And now look what's happened. They've gone out of favor. So here we are. And then architecture changed. So very simple. Gone are the details that we saw in those earlier photos. There's no porches anymore. And one of the reasons is because now we have TV and we have air conditioning. So whereas before, a lot of your entertainment was sitting on your porch, going for a walk, talking to your neighbors. Now we didn't need to do that anymore. And same with having the car. We walk less. It became a different lifestyle. This was the ranch. It was in some ways built on Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian home. Here's another version. So one kind of material, just brick, simple windows, very little ornament, and this was in style. I grew up in a neighborhood like this, and it was the first time we put cars in the front yards. There were driveways. Some had garages, some didn't. But you can see now that we've gone inward rather than outward in creating community. Even our multifamily, they turned them so you entered from the sides rather than have that grand entrance that you saw in the Gables multifamily development. This one's really blunt. So it's a bit off-putting and not as neighborly. This one at least faces the road, but again, that's simplicity. And then they went real wild on some, it was just in. They were trying all kinds of design, the ski chalet style, I guess, and then the split level became very popular. A lot of these in the neighborhood I grew up in. Retail, rather than walking along the sidewalk, like you saw in those early photos, now had parking lots in front of them. The architecture became very simplified. Our post office, we had a beautiful post office that looked like the City Hall. This got built in '62. And again, they meant well, but very simplified, clean lines. This we would call the brutalist style. Nice name. And it was about 7 stories by Chase Bank or whoever the bank was at the time. Same with this. And also we started eliminating houses for parking, because now we have to store those cars that we're using. Some, we made way, but others in greenfields, the model was, as I showed you earlier with Hillside, a parking lot and then the buildings, but no more Main Street. And we've all seen this. Then the next growth spurt, next 50 years, right? So we were in 1970, now 2025. Look at all that, how much we annexed. And that last third, I'd say half of the red to the west, starting at 83rd, that's what we're studying now. And we want your input, because we want to get back to the roots of when Greeley, in many ways, did planning in a better, more humane way, and more focused on people. And so now we're starting to shift. We're seeing it in architecture already with multiple materials, more detail, porches, attention to open space and the relationship between the building and the open space, fronting the structures right on the sidewalk. Paying attention to the natural environment. So the mountains in one direction, what is that view? And also amenities like lakes. We're hearing from a lot of young families, they want to be out in other places because they have nice amenities like this. So we're starting to get some of that. St. Michael's, you've seen that development, very nice architecture, and a town square. Unfortunately, it went up in '08 during the downturn, the financial crisis, so they've struggled, but it's coming back. They have a little town square where you can hear concerts, they have the coffee shop. So we are starting to see a shift, and that in many ways is a response to the market. People want to get that small town feel again. And we're starting to see new infill in downtown. This is Rich Mark that built the Maddie at 16th and 8th. And the Grand Dame of our downtown, we are working to ensure this will always be preserved. If it can't always be a courthouse, could it be a hotel? Could it be luxury units? Who knows? But these are the things we're working on. So from downtown, making sure we keep those special places we have and continue to revitalize in appropriate ways, all the way out to the west, and how we develop so that people are proud of Greeley, as we always have been, and we get the types of developments we want with the amenities we need, and pride in place. And I will now turn it over to Jason. So Jason is a highly experienced planner. He was with Dover Coal for many years. I used Dover Coal in probably 10 cities I've been in. He's the author of over 200 plans around the country and internationally. He is co-owner of his fairly new company, Able City. How old is it now?
2 years.
2 years. And he is the author of The Climate Planner and The Equity Planner. So, Jason, I'll turn it over to you, and then I'll introduce Jeff. Okay.
Well, that was fascinating. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. Let's give Ms. Flynn another hand. That was so terrific. Very quickly, I'd just like to tell you a little bit more about the project that we're working on and about the exhibits, the interactive exhibits in the back of the room. As Ms. Flynn said, we're working on a critical 22 square miles that's the western part of Greeley. Greeley's not an enormous place. It's just part of an area that's really one Greeley. We're working in the western area, roughly 5 miles from the downtown, and it's an area that has a mix of uses already. Neighborhoods and industrial areas, commercial areas, some important natural areas, and quite a few farms, right? Specifically, we're doing a plan and we're doing a code. The plan is an addition to the city's comprehensive plan, and the code is an addition to the land development regulations. And it provides guidance to help evaluate development projects, direct capital improvements, guide public policy, and ensure that Greeley continues to be the place that its residents want it to be. And the conversation so far has ranged from mixed use development to affordable housing, to environmental impacts, and to infrastructure needs. The plan is holistic. It handles all of these topics. Whatever we talk about tonight is applicable to this plan. And whatever brought you here, whatever is on your mind, is something that we can make use of in this plan. In some ways, we've just started. And what I'd like to tell you really quickly with the project timeline is just that this is not our last conversation. We're going to be working on a plan and a code. We're going to be back in workshop format. We'll have opportunities to present more information to you and to take more input. And then there'll be a formal adoption process, sort of the beginning of, say, February of 2026. In the back of the room, we've got sort of a community image survey, and it's simple. It just shows pictures of commercial addresses, it shows residential places, and it shows streets. And all it's asking you to do is to place red and green dots. Don't worry too much about what's in the picture. Just react, gut level, in a blink. What is it that you see? And do you like it? Do you want to see more of it in your neighborhoods or less? And when we come back, we'll tell you the results of that survey. There's also a community centers exercise on the other side of the room. And that's kind of an education for all of us in placemaking. And it talks about complete, compact, walkable, mixed-use communities as the default instead of the exception. So that's neat. And you're placing dots to help us locate where things should change when it comes to the zoning. It's very much Greeley's turn. So Ms. Flynn brought us, we went full circle, didn't we? We went from a time of real pride and investment to a time when things happened to happen very quick because the population was growing so quickly. And now we're returning to a period of focused and deliberate placemaking. I'd like to tell you that good places happen all the time and around the country. And we've been lucky enough to be part of the process and of the design of many of them. It's Greeley's turn. We've had a chance to design new main streets, places that have upscale housing that attracts the owners of new businesses, which brings jobs, places which have affordable housing, where the workforce, where there are people who work the restaurants, people who teach the kids, people who police our neighborhoods are able to live. And we're the designers of neighborhoods where there are trails and open spaces for people to enjoy. So the conversation we're going to have is about what are your priorities? What is it that you'd like to see? What should the western part of Greeley look like in the future? All right, with that, I think it's time to bring Ms. Flynn back up and to introduce Jeff.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that intro. Late-breaking news on the population history of Greeley. 500 people in 1870, 11,000 people 50 years later, 1920, 40,000 people 50 years later in 1970, and now 115. And there's talk that in 30 years we may double. I don't know if we'll reach that point, but we're going to grow fast, and we're one of the fastest growing areas in the country. Okay, on to Jeff. Jeff Speck is a big deal. It's a really big deal that he is sitting here and he will be speaking to you tonight. He is very much in demand, and I knew him back east, and I talked to him about coming here and what we were doing, and he said, sure, I'd like to be a part of that. He has given several TED Talks, and they have 3 million hits?
Right, one.
4?
I think 6.
5? 6? 6 million hits, TED Talks. Hope you'll watch some of them after this. So Jeff cut his teeth on many places, the Mayor's Institute of City Design. He was a design lead at the National Endowment of the Arts. He was a lead planner with DPZ, one of the biggest planning firms in the country that really launched the new urbanist movement. And then he went on his own and started his own firm. He was one of the authors of, I think it's the 3rd top-selling planning book in the country called Suburban Nation. It's really worth reading. It helps to understand how our cities got to where they are. And he's also of the Walkable City, How Downtown Saves America One Step at a Time. That was a book that really brought him much fame. And so he is going to speak about all that tonight. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Rachel. That was the best architectural planning history of a city that I've ever witnessed before giving a talk. And so congratulations on that. But it's no coincidence, Jason and I were speaking earlier, we don't do many regional plans because not many cities do regional planning. It's just, it takes a tremendous amount of wherewithal and foresight and ambition to actually plan an area of this size. And I think it's no coincidence that someone who would give a talk like that would also help to initiate this process. So yes, I was very excited to get involved in it because it is, I think, very much, as I hope to show tonight, going to be a principal factor in what your future in Greeley is like. So without further ado, I have a lot to say. The first is that my initials are JBS, so I was really excited to come here. Halfway through the show, I'm going to go over there for you guys, but I'm going to try and be fair. So I do feel very much at home. A little bit about me, and I'm going to come all the way over here so I can see the slide. Exactly. So just a little bit about myself. I think I had one really moment of genius, and that was discovering the genius of other people. And I was a student. I was about to go to architecture school, and I got to hear Andres Duany, who was the partner with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk with DPZ, give a talk at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts that absolutely changed my direction. As a designer, I thought I was going to be an architect doing buildings. That would have been awesome. But he gave this talk called Towns versus Sprawl and talked about the differences in the way that we used to plan cities and the way that we now plan cities. And it just blew my mind, and I did everything I could then after 4 years of architecture school to join the firm. So in 1993, I moved to Miami, made pilgrimage to the temple of DPZ, and spent 10 years there working on about 40 different projects with Andres, with Liz, principally new towns in Washington, in Alabama, in Texas, in Florida, in New Jersey, in Wisconsin, in South Carolina, in Colorado, around the corner, in Canada, in Mexico, in Belgium, learning what they do and how to not just do the work, but to communicate the work. And I've seen it as my role in this movement to share their message, which was so important to me, with as many other people as possible. So when I first heard Andres talk in 1989, I said, let me write a book based on what you just said, because it's so good. I sent them a letter, and they never answered the letter. But eventually, by 2000, we came out with the book Suburban Nation that told that story. That book's success got me appointed to the National Endowment for the Arts, where I got to move to Washington, D.C., and led grant making in design for the NEA, but also importantly, I got to oversee this program called the Mayor's Institute on City Design, where literally every 2 months, somewhere in the US, 8 mayors and 8 designers get together and they gather around a table for 3 days straight, and each mayor brings a case study. What's the most pressing urban design challenge in my city? And they try to solve those case studies. It's a fantastic program. I learned a lot from it. And then when I left the NEA after 4 years, I started working for some of those mayors. So I did a downtown plan I'll be showing you for Oklahoma City. I did a lot of transit-oriented development and other new town work like this one in Long Island. And that experience, also coupled with what I learned from all the mayors, led to the book Walkable City, which I'll be kind of using as the framework for at least the first part of our conversation tonight. It isn't that I'm into I am into walking. I love walking. I walk a lot. But it isn't that I come to planning from a walking perspective. What I've learned, I think, is that walkability is the best way to explain good planning. So, there's other terms, new urbanism and smart growth and livable community, and we used to call it traditional town planning. But I've found that just using walkability as a framework is the best way to help folks to understand what it is that we're about. So it's not just about walking, it's about building great cities and great towns. In Walkable City, I have what I call my general theory of walkability, a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's quite serious in the sense that it asks an important question, which is that in America, and particularly in parts of America like this, where pretty much everyone has a car, and everyone's used to driving everywhere all the time, right? And you're probably aware that driving is heavily subsidized, and that car actually, only 1/5 of the cost of driving that car are variable. Sorry, wait. Only 1/5 of the costs are variable and 4/5 of the costs are fixed. And that means that the more that you drive, the cheaper each mile is. And if you have a car sitting there in the driveway between you and everything, the smart thing to do is to use it. So in that framework, how do you create an environment in which people will make the choice to walk instead of to drive? And the answer is the walk has to do 4 things simultaneously. It needs to be useful, it needs to be safe, it needs to be comfortable, and it needs to be interesting. So we're going to march through, no pun intended, each of those categories one by one, starting with the useful walk. The useful walk was a story that Andres used to tell. He'd say, he called it the story of planning, and he told about how in the 19th century, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, and the planners said, hey, let's move the housing away from the factories. And they did that. And the lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and the planners were hailed as heroes, and we like to say they've been trying to repeat that experience ever since. So you have the onset of what Rachel referred to as Euclidean zoning, the separation of the landscape into large areas of single use. This was taught in school for many years. It's no longer taught in school. There's a general consensus now that this is wrong, that when you separate uses into large areas and connect them typically with only one big road, you've actually ruled out the possibility of walkability and a mixed-use walkable community. The problem is, of course, that even though we now know this is wrong, most of the time when I land in a city to do a plan, there's already a plan on the land, and it looks like this. And you have to undo that plan if you're going to make a walkable place. So it's interesting how this philosophy took over. The big World's Fair that millions of people went to, if you did not go to the 1939 World's Fair, chances are that your neighbor did. And there was the exhibit sponsored by GM and by Shell and all the automotive companies called Futurama. You've probably heard about it. The designer of Futurama was Norman Bel Geddes, and he had this quote that I've never really understood. Residential, commercial, and industrial areas have been separated for greater efficiency and greater convenience. Can anyone explain how it's more convenient to have your life split into these distant areas that you have to commute between to live? But this became the gospel. You can understand how it might have made sense from a pollution point of view, but not from a convenience or an efficiency point of view. And this was the city. This was the model. And it kind of took over. At the urban level, it looked like this. And of course, at the suburban level, it took the model that you're much more familiar with, which surrounds most of Denver and most of our American cities. So here's where I get to, and I'm going to walk over here now. Here's where I get to. I feel bad for you guys. So. This is the fundamental now new urbanist argument, or traditional town planning argument, which is that there's only two tested ways to make place in America. One is the traditional neighborhood, which you see one of them here. This is Newburyport, Massachusetts, near where I live, and the other is suburban sprawl. The traditional neighborhood is defined as being compact, diverse, and walkable. It's compact in the sense that you're actually looking at several neighborhoods of Newburyport. Neighborhoods are almost always a 5-minute walk from edge to center, so they're about a half mile across, right? It's diverse in the sense there are places to live, bigger houses, smaller houses, places to work, there's the factory, places to worship, the main street for shopping, places to recreate. Most of your daily needs are close at hand, and that's why walking is useful. And then finally, it's walkable because there's lots of streets and they all connect very nicely, so none of them have to be very big. In contrast, sprawl is clearly not compact, thus it's called sprawl. It's not diverse. You see a whole square mile, which is what you're looking at here, might just hold one use or one house over and over again. And it's not walkable in the sense that there's lots of streets, but most of them are dead ends or loops. And because most of the streets are dead ends or loops, very few streets actually connect. And those few streets that do connect then have to hold all the traffic of the entire community. So every half mile or quarter mile or so, you have this, what we call a traffic sewer, which is very noxious. You'll notice there's not a single address on this street. All the houses turn their backs, and it's not safe to live here. Everyone wants their kid to grow up in a cul-de-sac, perhaps, but your kid is actually 3 times as more likely to be killed by a car in this environment than in this environment. Because once you leave the cul-de-sac, of course, you're subject to the high speeds of these collector roads. So it's not a safe environment as well. It's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts, the places where you only live, where you only work, where you only shop. Schools get bigger and bigger. People consolidate their school systems, which means your school gets further and further away. The bigger your school is, the further away it's likely to be. We consolidate playing fields. Weston, west of Fort Lauderdale, is very proud of their 8 soccer fields and 8 baseball diamonds. But actually, the kid who lives in this house across the moat has a 1.5 mile drive to get to the game, right? So this is the part they forgot to count. And this is the traffic that Rachel referred to. When you separate everything from everything else and you reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system, which was initially created for commerce and for vacation travel, effectively becomes a commuting way. And that's the part that we all choke on. So I always tell people it's a 2-part deal. For many, this is the American dream, the house with nothing but other houses around it. But if that's your dream, then this is your nightmare, because you're going to be stuck moving from one part to the other, often to absurd extremes. This is actually in Massachusetts. But the amount that we invest so you never have to wait more than one cycle at a light, because that just feels so horrible, right? And the experience of being in these places. This is not Photoshop, this is Florida. It's very taxing on families. The longer your commute, the more likely you are to be divorced. That's an actual statistic. And then I got this slide from an epidemiologist who said, the reason why we have now the 2nd generation of American kids who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents is because we've ruled out of existence the useful walk in our community. And the idea that you would drive to park, to take the escalator to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, is why we have a morbid society. So, driving can be no fun, being a pedestrian can be worse. But these are the 2 models, and I'm going to show you this slide a few times tonight. But it's important to understand that sprawl and towns are the same stuff. But how big is it, and how far apart is it? And then importantly, do you have what's called a dendritic, or a branching road system, where all the streets go from the local to the collector? All the trips go from the local to the collector. Or do you have a traditional network? It doesn't need to be a rectilinear grid. It can be a curvilinear grid, it can be different shapes. It doesn't have to be so mundane. But the great irony of sprawl is that it was designed around cars, but it's actually worse for cars. Because, God help you if there's one engine fire on your collector road, your whole city shuts down for an afternoon. Whereas there's 21 ways to get from this lower left corner of this traditional town to the upper right corner because of the choices that a traditional road network gives you. So that was a discovery it took some time to figure out. So you've got this wonderful grid that you inherited, But you also have the other stuff. When you go from the east to the west, you end up in that branching dendritic system with a series of pods. One of the key goals of a regional plan would be to create more connectivity so that you don't have every single road hitting just two highways going east-west, which, as you know, get crowded with traffic fairly quickly. And then you have this experience of the streets that, like the ones I just showed you, that don't have any addresses on them because this sort of planning was done during the era when it was still considered appropriate to have a branching road system and individual pods of housing. Now, we've known, and other uses, we've known in the planning profession for now at least 20 years that this is the wrong way to plan, but it's been a long path to turn the ship around. So most plans that get made still use this system of collector roads, of branching paths, and it's not one that will allow walkability to happen. And this happened to us too, because people get frustrated when you're on these roads. So that's the useful walk. Now, the safe walk is where I spend most of my time because it's actually the thing that most cities can fix the fastest because cities own their streets and they can make their streets safe. Both when you're making new places, but also looking at the existing streets you have, there are lots of opportunities to make things safer. And we need to make things safer because, in fact, we're experiencing, you've probably heard, we're experiencing a pedestrian, vehicular homicide epidemic in the US. You are 78% more likely to be killed as a pedestrian now than you were 15 years ago. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Angie Schmidt talks about it in her book, Right of Way. There are two principal causes. One is what they call the suburbanization of poverty. And that poor people used to live in the inner city, but now the more expensive real estate is in the inner city and poor people are living in the suburbs in areas that were never designed for people to live when they don't have cars. But poor people don't have cars. And of course, your chance of being killed as a pedestrian are like 4 times as high if you're poor. So it's because they're stuck walking in this environment that was never imagined as a walking environment. But equally, perhaps more of a factor is just that what we call the vehicle bloat that's happened in the US. And that SUVs and light trucks, compared to a car, they're much harder to stop. They hit much harder. They hit you high instead of low. You end up under the vehicle instead of on the hood. When I read Angie's book, I sold my SUV and bought a nice low wagon, which, by the way, is much more fun to drive than the SUV was. So speed is what we can control. We're not going to change America's car fleet in the short term, certainly not out here. And suburbanization of poverty is something that is, is hard to fix. But in the short term, what we do is we look at the speeds. And what can we do in an existing environment, like downtown Greeley, and what can we do when we make new places to cause people to go really less than 30 miles an hour rather than more than 30 miles an hour in the places where people are around. A car going 35 miles an hour is about 7 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. So every mile an hour counts, and anything you can do to the environment that causes people to drive more slowly is going to have a good impact, or less of an impact on pedestrians. So the first thing, I'm going to name some of the things that make neighborhoods safer. The first thing is block size. Smaller blocks are safer. Having more frequent intersections is safer. This is Portland, Oregon. Famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks, really tiny blocks, some of the smallest in America. This is Salt Lake City, built at the same time, famously less walkable, famously 600-foot blocks, as you see. This is my family, or a part of my family, crossing a street in Salt Lake where they give you flags to wave, so no one will run you down. I thought this was kind of funny until I went to Granville Island in Vancouver, where they have this program called Grab a Brick. And when you cross the street, they give you a brick to hold, but hold it high, make eye contact, make sure you're seen. The funny thing is, though, these are Canadians, so it's a foam brick. It's not a real, they're so nice. It's not a real brick. But those are the two models then, side by side. You see Portland on the left and Salt Lake on the right. And notice that this is a study of 24 different California cities, about 6 down. When the average block size doubles, at the bottom, the number of non-highway fatal crashes almost quadruples. So you definitely want an environment with smaller blocks. You're in pretty good shape here. Your blocks are not as small as Portland, but they're much smaller than Salt Lake City. You see Salt Lake 600-foot blocks. You see your blocks are less than 400 feet. You've got nice sized blocks. This is where we say, you've got good bones. So in your downtown, you can definitely become even more safe in a pretty easy way. Item number 2 is the number of lanes. Clearly, any street that has more lanes than it needs to have, it takes longer to cross, cars go faster, it looks more like a highway. The big experience I had there was in Oklahoma City, which was named the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country. And when I visited Oklahoma City for the first time about 15 years ago, the mayor called me in because this alarmed him. And the taxi driver told me there are no shops downtown. And he wasn't exactly right, but the downtown was absolutely dead because it looked like that, right? That's what the typical street in downtown Oklahoma City. The mayor said, what can we do? I said, let's do a walkability study. He said, what's that? I said, I don't know, but let's figure that out together. And we looked at the car counts in the downtown. We're not trying to create traffic. We're not trying to create streets that are too small for the volume. But we looked at the actual volume, and we know that a 2-lane street can handle 10,000 cars a day. And we looked at these numbers of 9,000, 6,000, 5,000. These were streets that were all 4 to 6 lanes in the downtown with these traffic counts on them. So we said, let's just right size your streets to your traffic. And we did that. So happily, if you look at the bottom of the slide, you see this object against the park. Devon Energy was building a 51-story tower in the downtown that was going to create $200 million in tax increment. And they decided that basically the week that my walkability study landed. So they said, what should we do with this money? Oh, let's rebuild our entire 40-block downtown core from building face to building face with that money. And so it was my job to design the curb-to-curbs of these streets. I was able to eliminate 1/3 of the driving lanes. I was able to double the amount of on-street parking, which the merchants really loved. We added a bike network where there was no bike network. So a typical street went from this 3-lane one-way to a 2-lane two-way, a 4-lane one-way, 2-lane two-way plus train tracks, tram. This was the busiest street in the downtown, and we changed it to this. So that's the investment they made. And this, in conjunction with a real effort to get more housing downtown, has turned that city around. And if you go to Oklahoma City now, the streets aren't going to blow you away, but you have to know what it was like before. And it was just so dead before, and it's so lively now, and it's a project I'm very proud of. Next, number 3 would be the width of the lanes themselves. Andres Duany used to show this slide. He'd say, the typical street to the typical subdivision in America is now wide enough to allow you to experience the curvature of the earth. And he's right. Maybe you can see the donut someone did right here. But the standards have changed. The typical, this is a subdivision from the 60s. Here's a subdivision from the 80s. Same height of airplanes, same size of house. Notice the streets went from quite narrow to quite wide because the standard shifted. The wider the lanes, the faster people drive. It's completely understood. As a driver, when you're on a 12-foot lane or a 13-foot lane, you feel like you're on a highway, and you might go well above the speed limit. It doesn't matter what the posted speed is if you have all that elbow room. Thank goodness now there's NACTO. There used to only be AASHTO, with the H in AASHTO being highway. Now there's NACTO with the C being city. This is the Association of City Transportation Officials who say that 10-foot lanes are normal again. And you should feel very comfortable building 10-foot lanes. Are they that narrow? Not really. Here's a 10-foot lane up against a substandard, a 7-foot parking lane. Normally we do 8-foot parking lanes. But you can see these 2 trucks fit, but it's a little bit tight. So there's less elbow room. People are more likely to drive the speed limit. But then that's for commercial streets and urban streets. But what about just a street with houses on it? What about a street of single-family homes? Well, there used to be, and there still is in many communities, and many of us grew up on these streets, what's called a shared street or a yield street or a queuing street, where actually you only need about 12 feet clear between the cars, and when someone comes at you, which doesn't happen that often because they're small streets without a lot of population on them, you just tuck into the driver, into the parking lane. So here's one. Our friend Vince Graham built this one. We were the designers with Dover Cole, Jason's old firm, of Ion outside of Charleston. And Vince Graham was the developer. He's a very good speaker. He goes to conferences and he shows his famously skinny streets with narrow pavement, narrow right-of-way. And he quotes this wise philosopher who said, "Broad is the road that leads to destruction. Narrow is the road that leads to life." And it's true. So this is Bradburn, and I'm going to be taking you through Bradburn in Westminster, but we were able to achieve that in Bradburn, and I'll be telling you the Bradburn story in a minute. But this is a typical residential street in Bradburn, and it functions perfectly well, understanding that the fire chief does not love this, but the fire chief understands that more lives are saved by the narrowness of the street and the slow speed of the cars than are lost to the fire truck having to go a little more carefully through the neighborhood. Next, parallel parking. People say, oh, you're like a walkability guy. You must hate cars. You must hate parking. Let's have no parking in our streets. I love parallel parking. Parallel parking is an essential barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. And my faith in parallel parking was reborn when I did a walkability study in Fort Lauderdale, where before the study, you were not allowed to park on this side of him or she Boulevard in rush hour, which is also happy hour. This is a popular happy hour street. You can see you can park only on one side and not on the other. Here's happy hour on the parked side of the street, and here's happy hour on the unparked side of the street. Because no one wants to sit, walk, stand, exist 3 feet from a curb with cars whipping by at 30, 40 miles an hour. We've learned that. The other part of this picture, of course, is the street trees. Super important, particularly if you don't have parked cars. Street trees slow cars down, sometimes dramatically. The studies now show, though, that both pedestrians and drivers are safer on a street with trees along it because they drive more slowly, this being the exception. But they drive more slowly when the street is lined by trees. And of course, if you can line them up in a row, the perspective view, notice there's no parking on this side of the street, but the perspective view is one of protection. It's one of a wall behind the trees. This is a Dutch artist's interpretation of what a street feels like without the trees, without the parallel parking. And we all know that experience. And then you here in Greeley, I don't know what your ordinances are. I'm going to find out. But it's clear that street trees are a part of what you believe in here and support. And you've got a lot of streets that have both those things, parallel parking and street trees, on them. That was the biggest category, the safe walk. Now we move on to the comfortable walk, a little bit counterintuitive, because we all love, to get to the top of a mountain, get a broad view. But actually, the evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals, including humans, we're simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge for our sense of physical safety. It's in our bones. We can't help it. So we want to see our predators before they attack us. That's prospect. But we need to know that our flanks are covered. And if we don't feel that our flanks are covered from attack, we don't feel safe. And so the best places have really good edges. I say a plaza is only as good as its walls. A street is only as good as the buildings that frame it. We like to make outdoor living rooms. And we've been talking for some time about what the best ratio is of height to width. Generally, more than 1 to 6, which you see in the lower left, generally more than 1 to 6, you don't feel enclosed anymore. So we try to have tighter ratios. This is Salzburg, famously comfortable at 6 to 1. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. This is actually an old image of Houston, but I still show it just to remind us that it's typically the surface parking lot and the parking lot in front of the building that makes a space feel less like an outdoor living room than we would like it to. And your best spaces, of course, and you saw Rachel's beautiful old slides of the taller buildings framing the streets, but you've still got some, and the trees really help. But your two main streets that cut east-west downtown have this really nice spatial definition, which is one of the reasons why they're successful. And then you get a bit further back, of course, and this is a street that's going to attract fewer walkers because of the lack of spatial definition behind our lovely hotel. So, putting tables in a parking lot doesn't really cut it. If you want to be Europe, you create outdoor living rooms. This is Madrid, and the space that you get when you make a living room in the middle of a city. And then, I don't know how many of you have walked around the building, but when you get in this space, it's a similar concept of lovely sense of being in an outdoor living room, and the roof obviously really helps as well. So how do we make this happen? Since Seaside, which was the very first new urbanist development by Andres and Liz back in 1980, there's been this movement to replace statistical and legalese-based, use-based, Euclidean-based zoning codes with form-based codes. And this is the very first form-based code probably ever done since, the Renaissance. And what it does is it basically defines 8 different building types And then each building has rules about what its yard can be, where its porch goes, if it has one, if it can have outbuildings like granny flats, where the parking has to go, how tall it can be. But basically, it controls the shape of the building, but it doesn't control the use of the building, and it makes sure that streets are properly framed by building fronts. I also wanted to mention trees. Trees already showed up in the safe category. They're also super important in the comfortable category, particularly here in the hot West. This was a delight for me to visit another project that my firm planned, DPZ, called Prospect, that's in Longmont. And I'm focusing on Bradburn because it's a much more normal project. Prospect's a very weird project. If you know it, it's really fun, but it's more upscale, and it was definitely done with a sense of uniqueness. But the point I want to make is we planted these trees. I'm not that old. And we planted these trees, and they're just canopying across the street everywhere. And you'll see Bradburn has good tree cover, too. It does not take that long for trees to form a kissing canopy over the top of a street. So that's a comfortable walk. And then finally, the interesting walk. We don't like to be bored. We like variety. The great old American main streets, especially our western main streets, have this sense of variety, and they avoid repetition. So you have lots of hands at play, lots of different buildings that look different from each other, ideally by different architects, cheek by jowl. And that's what makes a great street. In our codes, we try to ask for that. The modernist movement was all about the problem of large numbers, which led to a lot of repetition, but repetition leads to boredom, and people don't walk. As Jane Jacobs said, almost nobody travels willingly from sameness to sameness and repetition to repetition, even if the physical effort required is minimal. And so we try to create a reward for walking, which is the variety between different buildings. And finally, I'll notice the secret sauce of new urbanism is regionalism, and the idea that we like places to look like where they are. I learned as someone trained in modern architecture that architecture must be of its time. That's useless. Architecture should be of its place. It can't help but be of its time. So architecture of its place means that our project outside of Georgetown looks like Georgetown, our project outside of Birmingham looks Alabaman, our project outside of Charleston looks like Charleston, and our project outside of Madison looks like Madison. Our project in Mexico looks like Mexico, and our project in Belgium looks like Belgium. So that's important too, and I think you want to ask people who work here to understand what the Mountain West aesthetic is and create a place that makes it rewarding to come here because it's different from other places. So that's everything. That's the 4 things. But you really need to do all 4 of them. And you can't just do 2 or 3. And that's the challenge. It's not easy, but we know how to do it. And we're here to help you do it. So that leads to the task at hand, which is a regional plan for 22 miles, which leads to the question, how do you make a regional plan? I've only worked on 2 of them. It's not done very often, as I said, and Jason's probably worked on just a few. But it's so important. And Jason reminded me, he's like, Jeff, I like your book, Walkable City, but my favorite book of yours is the Smart Growth Manual, which I kind of forgot about. But I wrote this book with Andres. I wrote it mostly about 20 years ago. It came out about 15 years ago. And it actually talks in great deal about how to make a regional plan. And the first thing that you need to know is that regional planning is the most meaningful form of planning because it's planning at the scale that impacts people's quality of life the most. So, first, think globally, act locally, but plan regionally. Then what are the steps of a proper regional plan? I'm going to start to walk through them. We're not going to exactly do these steps in this order, but I think it's important to understand how you try to do it well. So the first thing you do is you map the green print. The green print is the area that and this is where some consensus is helpful. It's the area where people feel it should stay natural. And that has a certain footprint. And we try to map that area, creating corridors, creating connective green tissue. For example, and by the way, I'm jumping around the different parts of the Smart Growth Manual, but different things intersect at different scales. So part of mapping the green print is linking green areas into continuous systems. You don't just want to have isolated open space. You want the critters to be able to get around, right? So you want the green part, and you want the trail system to be continuous. So you want the green parts to connect to each other. So link green areas into continuous systems. Now, you map the rural preserve. The rural preserve is different from the green print because it's the stuff that is protected due to where your gullies are, where your water flows are, and other rules that might exist on the land, there's a portion of the green print that is protected. But there's also a portion that's not protected, and that's called the rural reserve. And distinct from the rural preserve, the rural reserve needs protection. And so then you say, okay, well, one of the tasks of this plan is to identify the areas that aren't protected, that we want protected, and form a consensus as a community that we're going to incentivize their protection. So that's the first step. Of course, part of that is not just retaining natural areas and trails, but retaining farmland as well, both for food security. In this case, it's almost like national food security, not just local food security, right? Because you feed more than yourselves, but also to maintain your farmland character, which is so important to who you are as a city, as a community. And then, of course, preserving trees, particularly here, you don't have very many. And the trees you have in Western Greeley, the trees you have, there's a number that are really special. There's no reason why we don't start this process by saying we're going to save those trees. Conveniently, almost all the ones we saw were adjacent to wetlands and adjacent to gullies and adjacent to trails, so they're pretty easy to save without losing much land. But you definitely want to save your existing trees. And then, okay, what are the development priority zones? One of the things we're going to be asking you to put dots on the map about tonight in Jason's exercise is what are the areas that you believe are best suited for growth in the 22 square miles? And that's where we want to put neighborhoods. And specifically, we're not just going to lay in, uses. We want and this is where we focus so much of our energy. We want the development that lands on those areas to take the form of complete neighborhoods. And I spent a lot of time a few minutes ago talking about what distinguishes neighborhood planning from sprawl planning, and that's what we want to accomplish. So also, we're going to map the neighborhoods, but we're going to map the districts and the corridors as well. Traditional cities are not made up of just neighborhoods. They are made up of many neighborhoods, and every yellow blob you see here with a black dot in the middle is a half-mile neighborhood of the type that I described earlier, right? Each one of these little circles, they're not circular, but each one of these yellow blobs is a neighborhood. But cities also have districts. For example, here you see in the center, you see a downtown district of this city. You see a rail, warehousing district to the south. You might have an airport or something else. So cities are also made up of districts, which are large single-use zones. And then they also have what are called corridors. Corridors are the linear features of a community that both connect it together, like a road or a railroad, but also separate parts from each other because they form gaps, like your highway forms a gap in the middle of the city. So you map the neighborhoods, you map the districts, you map the corridors, and this happens to be a city with a transit corridor. The point I wanted to make here is that a couple things. I already mentioned it earlier. You kind of have just a couple major roads going east-west through the city. It's going to be key to your success as a place that doesn't choke on traffic as it grows, that you create other parallel east-west routes, and also more north-south routes than you currently have. Only then will you not be forced to continually widen the two roads that you have and have them become more and more of a traffic jam. So that's important. Now, two concepts that are key to good regional planning are the townless highway and the highwayless town. The townless highway means that, and this is certainly the goal of the DOT, but not what you see as you drive through this part of Colorado. The townless highway is about not allowing commercial uses to gum up your highway. These are ideas from the 1930s, the townless highway and the highwayless town. When the Federal Highway Act was first introduced, this was part of it. It was then removed by the city mayors who wanted more construction in their downtowns and allowed the downtowns to be ripped up by highways through the center of the city. But the townless highway says, if our highways are going to be effective, we actually have to have very few curb cuts and let them work like highways. So that's step number one. Step number two is, and this is a highway in California, in San Francisco, that was turned into a boulevard after many years of being a blight, and now it adds value to the neighborhood, that you shouldn't let neighborhoods be broken up by high-speed roads. Any road within a neighborhood should be a lower speed road. Connections beyond, this gets to the point I was just making, that when you make a new neighborhood, it needs to be pre-planned, and many of your existing neighborhoods that were built recently in Western Greeley have stub outs that say, okay, when something comes to my east or comes to my west, I'm going to connect to it. And that's really important because it takes the pressure off the main roads. Now, to accomplish this, I talked about the form-based code. The form-based codes have now been replaced by a more updated version that's called the smart code. This is actually an older version of the smart code. But this idea of form-based zoning, where part of what our scope is for you all, that Jason's firm specializes in, is to create a new code that will attach itself to your already quite sophisticated codes, and you're a step ahead of most places we work, but a code that attaches itself to your code and enables the sort of form-based zoning that I was talking about. Incentivize smart growth. This is the trick. We're going to provide you an alternative to conventional development. Will you do it? The biggest challenge for the city is to find those tools at its disposal to make it more attractive for developers to build this way than the traditional way, the conventional way, I would say. Now, what's in a neighborhood? I talked a bit about that, but the Smart Growth Manual talks about the different components that you want to make sure each neighborhood has if it's a complete neighborhood. You want to make sure you have a diversity of housing for young people, for old people, for richer people, for poorer people. You don't want homogeneous substrata of everyone living in one neighborhood having the same income. That's not healthy for society. Next, you want a little bit of retail in each neighborhood. You shouldn't have to leave your neighborhood to get cat food. You shouldn't have to leave your neighborhood to throw, get what you need to throw a party, right? So you want to have those retail places distributed. Civic sites. You should probably have at least one site for a church or a temple in your neighborhood. And if you don't have the church yet, save it because you'll probably get it later. And this has been the experience in many of our projects. Schools. If you do it right, you'll have an elementary school in every large neighborhood and a middle school perhaps between two neighborhoods so that kids can walk to at least elementary school and hopefully to middle school and maybe even to high school. Daycare, other social services, they belong in the neighborhood. And then, of course, the variety of different open spaces, like pocket parks. You might have one park in the center of your neighborhood, but notice how each quadrant of these two neighborhoods, there's a neighborhood to the left and a neighborhood to the right. Notice each quadrant has a park in it. You're going to see that in Bradburn as well. So here's one local example. I hadn't seen Bradburn. I was here for the groundbreaking, which I guess was in 2002. We worked on the plan around the year 2000. Bradburn is quite a story. The developer of Bradburn was the son of a successful developer from Syracuse. And he said, look, I want to do something better. I want to do something different. And he came out here. His name's Mark Falcone. His company's called Continuum. They're based in Denver. And they went around the whole Front Range. And they said, we want to build a mixed-use, walkable community that has most of the aspects of daily life, that houses young and old and rich and poor. But if we're going to do that, we need to break all your rules. I mean, Westminster at this point, the standard sidewalk was 3 feet wide with no trees and a rollover curb. I mean, the standards were just not good. And the fire department wanted one thing, and the police chief wanted another thing, and the public works department wanted wide streets. And he said, we're going to go to the community that wants this. And they literally went to Lakewood and, all the different towns, and Westminster said, we're in. Westminster had some public officials who were progressive, understood new urbanism. They said, we want to support this. And so they went to Westminster. And they created a neighborhood that is really kind of normal in all the pieces that are in it, but completely abnormal in that they're organized in that traditional way that we thought we had forgotten how to do. And so, I'll be taking you through it, but you have shops, you have offices, you have 2 churches, you have 2 schools, a big one and a small one. You have apartments for rent. You have row houses, bungalows, houses, and mansions. And they're all in the same neighborhood, and they're all neighbors, and they all hang out together. And it's all in one place. It's 150 acres, Bradburn Village in Westminster, Colorado. Who here has been to Bradburn? That is great that none of you have been to Bradburn. If there's one thing I would do is take you all by the hand and walk you around Bradburn. But I'm going to try and do that now virtually. There's a plaque here establishing the goals of creating a sustainable community as the principal objective with Bradburn. And here's the plan. And what you see is a conventional collector road, maybe even an arterial road to the north. And Bradburn is just one more pod off of that road. And everything else on this road is a pod. Everything else on this road is either an office park or a shopping center or a housing subdivision. And Bradburn is part of this system, so you could call it a pod. But what you see in this pod is, and I don't know if you guys over there, I'll come over there in a minute. But you have a main street coming in on the entrance. You then have a main boulevard, east-west, which separates the single-family neighborhood from the rest of the community. The main street is lined by row houses and terminates to the east on quite a large school. The main street has principally shops, and a lot of the shops are just one story because that was how it started. You know, no one knew that it was going to be special, and just plain old shops on the main street. But then as you got further in, some of these other shops have offices above them. So there's the boulevard with the row houses on it. Then you have this neighborhood that they sold to an apartment developer. And one of the big things to understand about Bradburn is it was all production builders. So they're the same builders who could build here. They sold this area over here to a production apartment developer. Then here you have single-family homes. There's the school again. And then you enter into the neighborhood, and what you're looking at is 3 sub-neighborhoods. There's one over here on the left, one over here on the right, and one over here to the south. Each one has its own pocket park, and then they all surround a central green, and they all share all those spaces. So I'm going to walk you now through the different parts of the plan. You see the sub-neighborhood here with its pocket park, the one here with its pocket park, and the one here with its pocket park, all surrounding the central green. So now we're looking in perspective. Here's the main street. You can see the shops that are just normal shops lining the road. There they are. They're one-story tilt-up. They're not fancy, but they're on a main street with a nice sidewalk. They're not, they're not behind a parking lot. Oops. There. That's the main street shopping experience. Then you come further down the main street and you have the shops that have offices above them, small offices. And then we've come further down the main street. Now we're looking at this boulevard here that has a beautiful tree-lined center where people drive to Bradburn in order to park and sit. People drive to Bradburn to walk their dogs. And it's lined by row houses. So this is single family, but much more affordable single family. Little front yards, very public civic fronts. That's what you see here along there. Now we're getting into the apartment complex to the right, but what you see here on the left is a street that terminates kind of a second kind of boulevard that heads into the center of town. This street heads to the big central green, but it terminates on that church. So it's on the left flank of this image. So there's the view, with the church tower right in line with the boulevard. So if you look south, you see the church. You look north, you see the civic green. You look west, you see the community center for the apartments. So now these are the apartments lining the street. They look like kind of like row houses, but these are rental apartments, much more affordable than anything else in the development. Then you go further east, and there's this single-family neighborhood that then gets you to where the school is. But of course, it's all part of the same neighborhood. The houses have rear lanes, so that the cars are in the back, so the fronts can look like this. As you continue down the boulevard, you see the school terminating the vista at the end of your walk. Now we're into the central green, which you see here. The main spine comes down. Notice to the right of that main spine, in the upper right, you have a club with a pool and a tennis court that all the residents can use. That's what that looks like. Then you go further up the street, and now we're looking at the central green, which is triangular, and interestingly, the sky has responded by opening up a triangular around the, diamond shape around the green. That's what the green looks like in part, with houses facing it across the street. And then we're going to go into some of the pocket parks and some of the housing. The typical street looks like this. Short setbacks, front porches that people use. It's clear there are a lot of people using their porches. We were there in the middle of the day, so people weren't home, but there's a lot of stuff out. Some of the streets are pedestrian streets, because if you have a rear lane feeding your garage, why does the front have to have cars on it? So some of the streets are pedestrian streets, smaller houses, kind of medium-sized bungalows. And now we're getting into this pocket park that you see here in the middle of this image. Looks like that. People really take good care of it. And now we're getting to the edge of the development where the largest lots are and look like this. And these have front garages because they're on the edge and the lots are wider. So it's all these different things that are just put together into one community. It's all the same uses. But here's what I want to say. Look, you can gather those uses conventionally, or you can gather them traditionally. And so, this is Westminster also. This is the conventional model. This is the traditional model, shopping. Office, this is the conventional model. of small office in Aurora. This is the traditional model above the store. This is multifamily in Aurora. The public realm is, this is what I call the buildingless street and the streetless building. Not to be confused with the highwayless town and the townless highway. But what you see there is a street that has no addresses on it at the bottom of the image, and then all these addresses were, oh, come visit me, I'm building C. Wouldn't you rather visit, and this is the public realm. Come to me in building C. Wouldn't you rather visit, 20 Central Boulevard rather than building C? So this is in Bradmer. Row houses, this is the conventional look for row houses, right? The garage is almost as wide as the house itself. This is the row houses in Bradmer. Conventional houses in Westminster, more garage than front. Houses in Bradmer. And this is the luxury model in Westminster at the end of the cul-de-sac, and this is the luxury model in Bradmer. So it's all the same stuff, but there's subtle changes to the pieces, and then of course the fact they're all put together. Someone said this to me. We don't want to be Aurora. So, I don't know Denver all that well, so I went and I looked at Aurora. This is Aurora. And, it's the exact model we talked about. It's very few streets, gigantic blocks, and then pods of single use. And that is so distinct from Greeley. These are the same scale. This is a square mile of Aurora, and this is a square mile of Greeley. But this is also a square mile of Greeley. So my point is that if you keep building the way you are building, you will become Aurora. It's that simple. And so you have to change your model if you don't want to be Aurora. And don't think that you won't grow. One thing we've learned from this is it's never a choice between growth or no growth. No growth movements last at most one political generation. And during that political generation, no planning is done. And then when building starts again, it's the worst. So growth is coming. You want to plan that growth. So it's the good type of growth and not the bad type of growth. So as just one example, we picked a random study area within our 22 square miles. And we said, what could that be? And here's what it looks like now. If you were to develop it in a conventional way, it would look like this. It would have 3, retail pads on the left side of the street and a bunch of houses on cul-de-sacs on the east side of the street. That's what it will look like if it's developed in a conventional way. Those same uses, the same square footage, the same number of houses could be made into this village. These are drawings that Jason's firm just did yesterday. It's the same stuff, just reorganized in all the ways that you've learned tonight through this conversation. So wouldn't that be nice? Then there's the other idea, maybe we just do larger lot, single family. That uses up a lot of farmland really fast. And the other idea that we will be including in this plan, by virtue of the green print, is the idea of clustering, right? That you can have the same number of units, or maybe get a bonus, have more units. Let's give you more units. But in exchange for a large lot, which you'll never really use, but you have to mow, let's have a collective public sphere that we really want to inhabit and get to know our neighbors, because it's built in a way that encourages walking. So those are the two models. And in this model, you can imagine, right, the preservation of farmland as part of your well-established quality of life here, where the village can sit across the street from the local farming. And you can have this amenity of this quality of life that you're known for. So I think that's how I end. Thank you for your attention. I do like to end with some resources, so let me just mention, if you are interested in learning more about this stuff, Walkable City has been called the gateway drug for potential urban planners. I saw some people holding it here tonight. Thank you for coming, if you already know the book. This is the book for people who are doing the work. This is called Walkable City Rules. It's more technical. It has more images, diagrams, data, charts. I recommend this book if you're actually, even an activist, but if you really want to get into the numbers and the detail, this is the book for you. Rachel mentioned the TED Talks. This one you haven't heard. It's 15 minutes on why it's important to be more walkable. You haven't heard that. The only justification I've given you is that you don't want to be Aurora. But there are really powerful health, wealth, environment, equity, and sociability reasons for making more walkable places, and I talk about that in this TED Talk, and there's another TED Talk that's more like tonight. So if you have a friend who wasn't here and they want the 15-minute version of how to be walkable, that's this talk. And then our firm is called Speck Dempsey, and our website has access to all of these resources. That was my last slide. Thank you so much for your attention. We are going to gather. Is anyone else going to speak before we gather at the back of the room? We're going to gather at the back of the room around all the boards, but there's also all of the exercises that Jason described. So just come and meet with us there. And I guess that ends our proceedings formally here. Please meet us back there. Thank you so much for your attention tonight.